Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another Hempology 101 lecture. I hope everyone had some warning about the change in plan and no one came hoping for Dr. Hornby today. He should be here next week, and I'll be promoting that as much as I can, because it'd be good to have a sizable crowd and get some good questions for him, because that's often when we get more of the critical information, is asking people like him questions. So not that his presentation isn't good, but certainly it'll be great to have him up here for an hour next week, finding out what he's been up to. And so today's lecture is on cannabis activism, something I should know a fair thing about, but I haven't honestly had time to do any research on. I guess I've been too busy doing activism. And I guess in my spare time that I've had, I have relaxed a little bit, kind of been doing nothing but the Sensible BC campaign that I'll come back to at the end has certainly taken up an immense amount of my time right now. And so I'm going to do today's lecture just kind of based upon my general knowledge of the subject. And I'm probably going to bounce around a lot chronologically and physically, because cannabis activism is a really broad topic. And so I've struggled actually with how to present today's class. Obviously the 9th year of doing this, taught it before, but I'd like to have a different angle each time, especially for viewers online that watch it year after year. But I think today I'm going to kind of go and just tell stories of activists and what they've done, or what people have done in groups that have helped bring us to where we are today. Because as I think we all know, today's climate is very active. There's a lot of things going on, and one couldn't characterize it all as activism anymore. But a lot of it still is tied to activism, or could be seen as activism. And a lot of the people I'm going to discuss today could be called activists, but for people like me who care a lot about this plant, it's one thing to be active and be involved in groups and events and projects, but it's also really important to actually eat and have a roof over your head and provide basic life necessities, and so many people have struggled going from being an activist in their spare time, as it were, to being a full-time cannabis educator, or even full-time employee in the cannabis industry. And a lot of the people I'm about to discuss certainly found ways to make money and make a living, while at the same time promoting cannabis policy. And it might be in some cases that only a small amount of their time is actually changing the law. Some of us are so busy actually, just managing projects that are already going and employing people and doing stuff that we don't really have a lot of time for what one might call activism. I'm a little different, but I could name many people that are just so busy working that they don't do activism. And that could go from a broad range. I would even start with growers. Every person that has grown cannabis under these prohibition laws has been an activist. They might not be thinking, hey, I got a seed, and this seed is my ticket to being a full-time professional pot activist. They want to grow pot and sell pot. That's what they're thinking. But the mere act of planting and growing and cultivating, or trafficking is act of, is activism, in some form or another, if again you're doing it in a state that's prohibited. And a lot of people don't realize that until they've been caught, and then they become activists. They don't consider themselves as such. But as soon as you cross the line in a way, even possessing and using cannabis illegally, you become an activist. You not only think that the government is wrong, but you're defying the government. You're doing something. It might be the most passive form of civil disobedience that there is. Smoking a joint. I don't think there could be anything more passive than that. But as it were, it is something that everyone who has defied these laws since the 1920s and 30s has been an activist of some form or another. And there's very few people that have become involved in the movement or full-time employees who didn't fall in love with the herb first by smoking it. And so it's very, very rare. I would struggle to name anyone, at least any successful person in the cannabis field, as it were, that didn't start at least once by consuming it. So we've all stumbled into activism, usually unintentionally. Nobody's like, yeah, I want to be an activist, I'm going to smoke a joint, and from there on, at the age of 16, become an activist. My own story is a good example of that. I'm not going to get into it, but I certainly had no intent of that in my earlier age. I was just smoking a joint. It was rebellious. I knew it, and so anyway, there have been, though, obviously a lot of people that have done much more than grow and sell. And I'm going to start today's kind of storylines with Keith Stroh, the founder of Normal in the United States. Keith was a young lawyer in the late 60s, I guess. There was a lot of things happening in the counterculture, as it was known as. In my book, I actually, really don't pinpoint many cannabis activists before the early 1970s, in part because most of the activists in the 1970s were really more counterculture activists, like Timothy Leary and a number of other individuals were using LSD and a bunch of other drugs and were really promoting this tune in, turn out, drop out? No. Oh. I haven't read this
Tune in,
one.
turn on, and
Drop out, I think.
oh shit,
I think that was.
until you
I
start to
haven't
say
read my
it.
book for a while. But certainly the 1960s and the radicalization that was occurring in the counterculture, wasn't really trying to change the world as much as they were just trying to drop out of it and just not participate in it. And there were a lot of things that happened. Yeah, like I say, chronologically, I just know I'm going to bounce around a bit. So in the 1960s, there was a bunch of things that happened that sort of laid the roots before I get to Normal, that kind of broke things open. One of them was the be-ins that started to happen in the 1960s. I'm probably wrong here again. I should have read my book on the weekend. But I believe it could have been 1965 the be-ins started in different parks. I think it was a bridge in San Francisco that the first one occurred in, where there was just this nice space and everybody decided to go and just gather for the day and do a bunch of drugs and play a bunch of drums and just be freaks, I guess would be the best way of putting it, because that's certainly what their intention was. And so these be-ins were these sort of intentional gatherings that really cannabis was part of the mix, but it was never really the focus of many of the actions in the 1960s, except for the beginning of 420s, and I'll obviously come to 420s in a little bit here. But the first real group that I know of Oh, and I should put in a good word for Allen Ginsberg as well, a poet and activist in the 1960s, counterculture revolutionary, I guess you could call him. But he was certainly one of the more outspoken cannabis lovers of the 1960s. He was a very well respected poet in the beatnik community and outside of it as well. And I don't know if it's in my book, but it should be. I have this image in my head, this beautiful picture of him standing there. And Alan's this gentle, bigger kind of guy, kind of big teddy bear kind of image. Just not an aggressive character at all, and standing there with a sign that said, pot smokers are nice people. Just this simple message. It wasn't like change the law. It was just kind of like stop hurting us. Anyway, Alan deserves some credit for the 60s. He was one of the more pro-cannabis, but really it wasn't until in a sense Richard Nixon coined the term the war on drugs in the 1970s, that there was a real concerted effort to try and change the laws. Through the 1960s, they were flaunting the laws and ignoring them for the most part, although enforcement of certain drug laws was starting to come into effect. It wasn't really till Nixon came on that an opposition to the drug war started to really form, and in particular with cannabis. It was quite clear to a certain segment of the American society that the prohibition of cannabis was really nonsensical, that the harms were overrated, and there were really no real good valid reasons for it in a lot of people's minds, but there's no science to prove it. But certainly the consent amongst people was that there were way more harmful drugs. And I mentioned LSD, but there's a lot of other drugs that were being used in the 1960s, that were far more powerful than cannabis and addictive, let alone alcohol. Much more than today. We had this poly-drug using community that wasn't huge. It wasn't we sometimes glorify what the 1960s was. Well, it was honestly like just handfuls of people in cities that were thinking outside of the box. It wasn't like a third of the youth took off and grew their hair. It was really a small percentage of them. And so anyhow, Keith Stroop, young lawyer, formed NORML in 1970, which was, to my knowledge, one of the first, if not the first, pro-cannabis organizations to form really in the world. I could be wrong, but there weren't that many through the 1960s. Like I say, lots of people spoke out about it and used it, but NORML was mostly lawyers formed in Washington, D.C., a very focused group that decided that they would go essentially state by state and get ballot initiatives and get the vote on the table to decriminalize the possession of cannabis in so many ways, exactly like what we're doing here in British Columbia just 40 years later. But the consensus, was in many states in the U.S. Growing towards decriminalization. Legalizing it and exactly how that would occur is much more debatable. But the majority of people can agree that it's a waste of police resources, certainly the simple possession laws. And that was really the drum that NORML beat early on. And they, I think, had some really good talking points. The draconian punishments of the possession laws in the United States would ruin many young people's careers after being caught with cannabis. It was very harmful. people down there, and I'm not sure when all these laws came into effect, but now it's like you lose your right to vote if you're busted down in the United States. You know, you can be kicked out of your school or never get allowed into schools again. Certainly your employment can be severely hampered if you've got a conviction of cannabis. And so there were a lot of good reasons for people, obviously, to get out of it. And I think up until 1975, I think there was upwards of 15 states that either had already decriminalized it, like Alaska. I believe Alaska was one of the first ones. Or they had these kinds of ballot initiatives in the works. And so through the early 1970s, NORML in particular really led the way. There weren't a lot of other groups, which was very helpful. So it was like everybody that wanted to fight the cannabis laws just got involved in NORML. So they really branded themselves very well, to the point where here in Canada, even today, you know, when you come up to people who have very little knowledge of what's happening in the movement, you know, haven't read a book or a magazine on the subject in years, you know, often one of the first things they'll say is, well, what is NORML doing? You know, it's just, they branded themselves in the early 1970s just very, very well, and were very successful at it. And since, it's not like they stopped, but there was a sort of turning point that I think I brought up in years past, but it's an important lesson to learn, and one that I myself, you know, may have at least in some measure risk having problems with, and that is associating yourself or using other drugs when you're a cannabis activist can sometimes come back to hurt you. Luckily for me, it hasn't yet, although ironically, the nickname Acid Head Ted probably helped lead me into my activism, which, like I say, it's maybe I won't get into a lot of my story, but this part's kind of funny. So when I started university, I got nicknamed Acid Head Ted by my rugby team because I had long hair. I was in Ontario, and I really stuck out amongst these jocks that just couldn't make the football team. So they liked picking on ruggies, and I got that nickname. I wasn't really that much of an acid head at the time, but I did more than the rest of the team. I certainly embraced the name. If anything, it also helped bring potential customers of mushrooms and hash that I sold in university as well. Because the nickname Acid Head Ted did me very well for attracting customers. And it also empowered me. I became a very outspoken opponent of the drug law, just flaunting it, you know, introducing myself to complete strangers as Acid Head Ted, and otherwise, you know, just opposing the law in word and in deed as much as possible. And so that nickname, in a way, kind of led me to where I am, and I certainly, you know, love to do LSD now still. And the first event we ever did here at the University of Victoria was actually on April 16th, the first, the 53rd LSD anniversary back in '96, I think it was. And so, you know, when we combine, you know, our use of other drugs or other drugs at these cannabis events, there is actually a great risk that is taken, and I've decided for a bunch of reasons not to mix up my love of other drugs with my cannabis activism. And luckily I haven't got a horror story like I'm about to share with you now, but I've had some close calls. But there is a horror story from NORML that actually changed things, and if this one event had not occurred, or this one little part of the event, we probably wouldn't be here today. We would be living in a much more normalized world when it comes to cannabis use. But 1975 comes along, and the climate in Washington, D.C. was quite positive. A lot of people in the political scene under Jimmy Carter, whose administration was quite different than the Richard Nixon one, were quite favorable towards changing their laws. Jimmy Carter had a drug policy advisor, like a senior policy advisor, and Robert Bourne, who was in many ways helping Normal state by state, have successful ballot initiatives. And there was this real sense of optimism going through Washington at the time. And then Robert Bourne actually showed up at their 5th annual gala, where they're having a big 5-year anniversary party in a really fancy hall. In a way, Normal was celebrating hitting the big time, because the momentum was there, the money was there, the lobbyists were there. It was, the media was really behind them, and then Robert Bourne shows up at their party, and they're like, "Oh, this is awesome, let's party on, dude." And things were great. I guess there wasn't actually a problem at the event, but when Robert Bourne went upstairs and started doing cocaine in one of the lobby rooms with a couple of dozen people just kind of coming and going from the event, things felt a little nerve-wracking. But again, nothing happened that night. It wasn't reported upon for a couple of weeks. And then some small-time Washington, D.C. social magazine printed the fact that Robert Bourne was doing cocaine at the Normal 5th anniversary, just almost as part of like the social column. It wasn't even like condemning him, but it didn't need to, because as soon as the opposition got wind of the drug policy advisor for Jimmy Carter doing cocaine, it just completely blew up. And Robert Bourne lost his job. The Jimmy Carter administration completely changed the direction that they were going in, and stopped helping out the ballot initiatives, and really distanced themselves as much as possible from any initiatives to changing the law, and couldn't do anything about what Normal was up to. But Normal definitely took a huge hit. They took a hit with their supporters on the ground, who were very disappointed with the just party taking over the seriousness of the organization. And it's really, like I say, probabchanged where things were going, and much bigger than we might expect. But anyway, so in the 1970s, a lot of people not only picked up on Normal, but started to be more involved and outspoken. A lot of people found ways to become activists and write books and such. I'll use, I didn't bring one of his books, but Lawrence Chernick is a fun example. Lawrence now has several books on hashish, but the madman actually in the 1970s and I think early 80s would go around to like Afghanistan and Morocco and Pakistan and Tibet and all these crazy places living under military law, and would sneak in there with his cameras to take pictures of people that were growing cannabis and making hash. And so his form of activism was with his camera and writing books, and he was quite successful and was world famous for that now. So a lot of people like Lawrence just started to do their own thing. And I should really almost have started with Jack, but Jack wasn't really a leader in the movement in the 1970s. Jack Herer lived in California and certainly was involved. I shouldn't say wasn't a leader. He was a leader in that. Again, there weren't that many people doing stuff, so pretty much every one of them was a leader. But Jack certainly was very keen on cannabis, and what separates Jack from other activists is partly his love of hemp and his keen research abilities. because in the 1960s and 70s, cannabis activism was primarily for recreational uses. I'm going to get to medical activism in a bit, because there's different forms of activism. Gee, I was going quick, so we'll see how I do. But yeah, Jack was very interested in hearing about this cousin of cannabis, because every once in a while, just little bits and pieces of information would come to him. Like people would say, "Oh yeah, like they used to make paper out of hemp and cannabis," and the Reefer Madness story, was buried, but it was part of our history that Jack was able to dig up, because really a lot of the history of cannabis and its prohibition had been lost. And people in the 1960s and 70s were almost starting from scratch on a human rights note, saying, look, like this is wrong because you're taking our rights away for no good reason, right? And it was really based on that, and it wasn't really understood the economic engine behind prohibition and how big and influential it was. And so the more Jack dug into that, the more I guess enthusiastic he was for the revival of the hemp plant. Not only because he saw this injustice being done to the plant and to the people on the planet as a whole, but that he saw that this plant could turn it around. He had great faith in cannabis and its ability to rejuvenate agricultural communities and provide food and fuel and fiber for building materials and the whole host of things that we're starting to see happen now. Jack realized its potential, and so it took him years to put a real book together. I guess in the 1970s and early 80s, he'd have the odd handouts and pamphlets and stuff, and you can see old pictures of Jack where he'd go to events and he'd have like a tent and selling all these different t-shirts and things like that with pot leaves everywhere, flags, all this stuff, and I think it was 1985 that he finally published The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which really I think hit the cannabis community out of nowhere. Like there would have been some people in California who would have met Jack and known about this, but for the most part, people across the United States and around the world had no idea that hemp had this direct relationship with cannabis. And we owe Jack a tremendous amount, not only for the research that he did, but for the work that he did after the book came out, because he was relentless. Gail met him after he'd suffered a couple of strokes, and the old guy was still just plugging away, going full tilt every day, just promoting, going to events, whatever he took, until he passed a couple of years ago. Just relentless and inspiring, and just a magical person who, in doing this work and putting this book out, just broke it open and again exposed the emperor for having no clothes, and helped encourage a lot of other people to do similar things. Chris Conrad would be another notable activist from the United States. I just brought one of his books here. He's published several books. He's done a lot for hemp and cannabis down in the United States, and is still going strong. And so, the publishing of books for a lot of activists has been a means to support their livelihood and promote what is happening in the industry as well. And so there's a list of people who would be certainly considered activists. Ed Rosenthal would be a good example, where he's like got a whole pile of grow books and other books on legalizing it as well. But the majority of his books are certainly grow books. But Ed is definitely an activist in what he does and the way he promotes himself, and deserves a note for his work there. So there's a Lots of stuff to talk about. Yeah, so I guess economic activism for a lot of people has been the means to not only make a living but to make change. And there are a number of notable Canadians in that field. I wouldn't pretend to know all of them throughout the United States, that's for sure. But there's a number of individuals here in Canada who have found the right way to make a living or not, but have made great waves. I couldn't have a lecture today on this topic without discussing Mark Emery, for example. Mark Emery is a very interesting character, as most of you would know, whether you've met him or not. And I don't want to take up a lot of time, but certainly his style of activism has been very successful in certain ways, and yet not, because unfortunately the man is in jail as we're having this lecture, and he's really paying the price. But in the strangest of ways, it's almost something that he wanted to do, that he saw this as being his mission, his goal, to essentially in some sense martyr himself without hopefully losing his life in doing so, because the term martyr traditionally means that you would lose your life for a cause. It doesn't mean just go to jail, although that's less the case. Many, for example, would say Nelson Mandela was a martyr for his cause of apartheid. But again, he didn't necessarily lose his life. Hopefully in this day and age and in the future, martyrs won't necessarily have to lose their lives in order to support a cause. But in times past, anyone like me that stood up to the government would lose their life before they had a trial. And so we're quite fortunate to be able to say that he's in jail in that sense. But certainly Mark knew what he was getting into. He had been advised by his lawyer that selling seeds to the United States would end him up in jail. But Mark was very keen on this economic activism that I sort of referred to. He saw that as the engine, the drive, that just the more money you make and the more stuff that you're going through, the more momentum there is. He really, in some ways, saw that. And I had some clashes early on with him. Honestly, he told me that my work doing education for free and nonprofit medicine was not going to be successful. I should get a job and buy more stuff at his store. He literally told me that, because
look at you now.
he just, it's ironic, but he really saw that paying for the rent and being able to do more than just survive was really important. And so when Mark got his store for Hemp BC back in the early 1990s, again, when hemp was illegal here in Canada to grow, he saw that the best way to get hemp in the community and in the conversation was to sell it, and to get his store at Hemp BC, and he did it. He promoted the heck out of it, and took a lot of sort of risk at times in doing so. But he not only got the hemp store up and running, but then he got Cannabis Canada, sorry, at the time going. And that has been another way of individuals such as myself to keep things going and get the word out, is through publications. I've probably got at least a dozen different magazines that have tried and failed to keep going, because it is a real struggle to keep a magazine going. And Cannabis Canada, which turned into Cannabis Culture, had a really good run at it. I believe they printed close to 70 issues before they had a problem. But getting publications out has been a really great form of activism. I just also have to put it like, yeah, there's so many ways to do activism. You don't have to get on a soapbox. Like on the front cover here, for example, I got a picture of Bong Man, who's a real character in Ontario. This great big costume of a bong that my friend wears around to different events, and he's got some T-shirts made up that he sells and stuff. There's been many other people that have made costumes of various types that have found a really fun way to be an activist, which doesn't take any words, just go out and having fun, like, which to me is one of the best forms of activism that you can do, because when you're out there kind of having fun with cannabis, in a lot of ways you're doing two things. You're undermining the prohibition of the laws, and on the other hand, you're building a community and just building bridges. I guess I'm also thinking about my game show, Reach for the Pot. I really like my game show because it's a form of activism that on one hand is very empowering for those of us that are playing. It's like, yeah, we're playing a cannabis game show. It's novel, it's unique. But I think for people, on the other side of the law, seeing us playing a cannabis game show is just making a complete mockery of them, almost. If they truly believe in this law, they would have to, see that we're just, making a joke of it. And so I think any form of laughter around cannabis that people can generate is good. And so a lot of people that would be cannabis activists have done other things, or for example George Carlin, like a brilliant man, comedian, but a lot of his talks or a lot of his jokes are around cannabis and drug use. Not exclusively, but he's had some pretty good rants about it, one-liners, and it's been brilliant because he hasn't just focused on cannabis, but he'll include that in his work. And so he might not be a full-time cannabis activist, but his jokes are very powerful. I've heard some of his rants, and he really does, on one hand, give us something to laugh about, and on the other hand, just totally strike at some of the real true problems of the prohibition of cannabis. And so, George is particularly brilliant at helping things be fun at the same time as educational. So so Mark Emery really is one of a number of Canadian entrepreneurs who's been successful, and Mark's got a really long story, and he started selling seeds soon after getting his magazine going, because for a lot of us, especially getting a publication going, it's good to have some other means of financially supporting it. The Cannabis Digest has been really lucky because we've had the Cannabis Buyers Club, really feeding us money at times to get it going. Now it's close to paying for itself, but it's been a real trick. Mark Emery had a store at Hemp BC. A lot of Cannabis Canada in the beginning was promoting, the hemp products and stuff Hemp BC was selling. Then very quickly it went to seed sales, not just Mark's seeds, but other seeds, which was a brilliant strategy. And he really, did a great favor to not just the people that he did business with, but to all the other people that behind him have quietly come in and set up seed banks or seed stores of different types, online or physically. Because before Mark did that, it really wasn't very open. It was very hard to find good genetics. You pretty much have to go to Amsterdam. And so getting into the seed business and being so loud about it, promoting it in his magazine and such, was not only good for Mark, but it was good for the greater community. I think the number is something like $14.5 million in seed sales over that time, and approximately 4 million of that went back into activism of one type or another. And so that's a lot of money. That 14.5 million in sales essentially went to, like I say, 4 million to activists, so that's another 10 million that went to support growers and middlemen, basically, and plus some office supplies, I guess. But it was a very lucrative business, and one that Mark sponsored any number of projects with, including the marijuana party. Now, I have a whole lecture on marijuana politics, so I don't want to venture onto too much of that. But obviously, political work with cannabis is cannabis activism, in some ways of one of the more important types. And Mark saw that, and for a long time was really pushing the marijuana party. I believe it was 2002 they got 4% of the vote in British Columbia in the provincial election. So it wasn't anywhere near getting people elected, but it was a fairly strong showing, especially because they didn't even have candidates in the entire province, and it was something that was kind of a one-shot deal. The marijuana party fell apart a little bit after that, because by the time the next provincial election came along, I think Mark had been busted and the seed business sort of dismantled, temporarily in some ways at least, and the money wasn't there again. I guess another cannabis activist entrepreneur of note would be Dominic Kramer. Most of you guys probably don't know much of Dominic, but you've probably heard of some of his work. Dominic was one of the founders of the Toronto Compassion Club in Toronto, obviously, and then went on to form a host of businesses. He also got a hemp store going, the Toronto Hemp Company, THC. Trying to remember, maybe he even got the Toronto Hemp Company going first, because it is one of the oldest in Canada. If you ever have a chance to go down to downtown Toronto on Yonge Street, 3 stories, grow stuff in the basement, floor of pipes and bongs up top, and all sorts of stuff in between. One of the nicest stores in Canada. He also has a seed business down the street, Sacred Seed, I think it's called. And then just upstairs from, not quite upstairs, but just around the corner really from the Toronto Hemp Company, you'll find Vapor Central, which is one of the few vapor lounges, well, I shouldn't say few, there's like half a dozen in Toronto. There's actually more vapor lounges in Toronto than there are in Vancouver. And so, so he's got the Vapor Lounge, the Seed Bank, the medical marijuana store, the dispensary. I think, at one time he had the Kindred Cafe as well. Then that got busted selling shakes, cannabis-infused shakes. Which kind of goes into another area of activism, which is getting busted. A lot of changes have occurred through changes in law. And again, I have another lecture on law, so I don't want to venture into it too much. But certainly, a lot of us have done acts of civil disobedience to challenge the law, if not to try and prove that it's unconstitutional, just to try to undermine it with sheer mass civil disobedience. And so, there's a lot of events that are held with the primary goal to be, this kind of mass civil disobedience of, pot smoking is obviously the more common theme. Although in Vancouver now, even open dispensing of cannabis has become common at some events. On Canada Day and April 20th now, they set up pretty much farmers markets where they bring pounds and pounds of cannabis, tens of thousands of dollars worth of pot, probably hundreds of thousands are sold right on the front steps of the art gallery in downtown Toronto on both of those days. The vendors on both days start setting up, like, 5 o'clock in the morning, kind of elbowing each other for room, and it's really amazing to see, how large and accepted the 420s have become in Vancouver. But they haven't always been thus, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit to 420 and its earlier root, because it's just a funny story. The first 420 meeting was actually a couple of high school kids that were getting out of detention at 4:15 who wanted to gather, I think, with some other kids that might not have been in detention or not, but either way, they got out at 4:15. So 4:20, they got together to actually go steal some pot plants. One of them thought they knew where the pot plants were growing. And so they met at 4:20, and then they struck out from there and weren't able to find any plants. So they got together again the next day at 4:20. Like, we're going to go find the plants. I think I know where they are today. It was basically the theme. And they tried and failed again. The third day, the little buggers got together at 4:20 again. Same plan. We're going to go find some pot plants. Except one of them had a different plan in mind. He's like, you know what, guys? I got to join. Let's skip the running around and just smoke this. And that was the first 420. And I guess it just stuck amongst this group of high school delinquents, nevertheless. And so it grew as a tradition, not only in that school, but it very quickly spread over into the counterculture of the people following the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Starship. It has actually been traced back to some of the original kids at the first 420s were like younger brothers of guys playing in these other bands. So it was like just little brat brother causing trouble, and so a lot of the followers of these bands just started to incorporate 420 both as a time of the day to smoke pot, but just as a code even for cannabis use, so that they could somewhat discreetly throw that number around, and if somebody knew what 420 was, well, then it'd be like, hey, so you wouldn't have to notice whether someone had long hair or looked different in any sense. If you heard 420 out of their mouth in a strange context, you knew they were a pothead. And to this day, you see 420 sprinkled throughout literature and movies, and just the oddest places. In a sense, as a form of activism, I would suggest that anytime you can slip cannabis or a cannabis reference into the community, whether it's a pot leaf in a piece of art, a reference in a song or a poem, or just some means by which the public is exposed to cannabis, I think is a form of activism. And so or even just wearing a pot t-shirt around town, that is in essence a form of activism, just bringing it out of the closet. There's a lot of other activists and activism that I could mention. So back, I say chronologically, this is a mess, but hemp became legal in Canada to grow in 1998, and before that, a lot of us, because I became involved before it was legal to grow here, screamed bloody murder about it not being available here, but we could import it and make products out of it, and a lot of not a lot, but some companies in the United States did that, including Dr. Bronner's soap. And Shane was talking about this and showing it off the other day. I don't think a better example of a cannabis activist entrepreneur could be mentioned than Dr. Bronner. And I mentioned Keith Strope as being one of the first activists. Well, in some ways, Dr. Bronner should deserve that credit, because he's long passed away now. I'm not sure when he started these things. But he caught on a long time ago that the products that were being made and sold in stores were quite harmful to us. And he produced some soaps using hemp oil as one of the main ingredients. I think pretty much every one of them have hemp oil in them. It's not entirely that. This one here has coconut and olive oil and then hemp oil. But it's certainly one of the more common products in here. And so he was not only one of the first to make a product out of hemp and promote it very heavily in its use, but he did this really unique piece of work on each one of his bottles, and they're all different. There's like 6 probably different kinds of soap. This one's a lavender. And he just rants, like this one here on the top: to keep my health, to do my work, to love, to live, to see to it that I gain and grow and give, never to look behind me for an hour, never to wait in weakness, nor to brag in power, always working, searching for more truth, more light, always writing, teaching what I found good and right, robbed, starved, beaten, fallen, wide astray, back with the full truth I've learned, back to the way.
It rhymes too.
Pardon?
It's like it rhymes too.
It probably does. It just wasn't, laid out for me very well. But yeah, like it's just one little rant after another on his bottles, and he rants about corporations and the chemicals that they use and all sorts of stuff at times, and it's filtered down through the generations. So not only is Dr. Bronner's soap one of the bigger soap companies in the United States, the grandson David is a very keen hemp activist. We referred to him the other week. I looked it up today to confirm what he did. A couple of years ago, in an attempt to bring to light the problems with these laws, he actually had a steel cage made for himself that he had taken off a truck and placed on the front lawn of the DEA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And he had himself locked in this cage with a bunch of hemp plants that he had in pots, and they were fully seeded, and he intended upon cutting down the plants while everybody was filming him in this big cage, and harvesting the seed out of the plants and pressing the seed for oil, and then putting that on some bread that he had made, and then sharing it with people around him. That was his form of activism. He was arrested before he could actually follow through and separate the seeds. I think he was still in the act of cutting the plants down when they finally convinced him that if he didn't open the cage, that it was going to be a dangerous situation. But they were going to open the cage if he continued to proceed. So it was an excellent opportunity, and I know David Bronner's done a few other things down in the United States to encourage hemp growing and use down there. And there's actually a crop being harvested, or has been harvested, in Colorado this year. And so it was an illegal crop, but the laws for recreational use in Colorado were changed last year, and I forget the name of the individual, but the article just came out last week where they've made their first hemp harvest in Colorado, because I think it was 55 acres of hemp that he grew illegally. Yeah. But nobody stopped them. 55 acres. Yeah, I know. Not just a couple plants, like I say. Like they're growing hemp down in the United States, and so the authorities turned a blind eye to it, and it's go. There are farmers, I think all across the United States that are ready to grow hemp this coming spring, whether all the laws have changed or not. As I said earlier, like sometimes growing this plant is one of the best forms of activism there can be. And so that's happening in the agricultural community in the United States. I really hope here we have somebody with their wherewithal together to challenge the hemp laws here that only let us grow if we have 10 acres of land under cultivation, because the current hemp regulations in Canada are quite restrictive, and it's going to take some form of activism to change that. The farmers aren't going to. They're quite happy with that rule because it protects their economic interests. If people can't grow their own hemp seed, well then they've got a guaranteed income. So, the change in law will have to happen somehow through a grassroots movement. It won't happen from the industry here in Canada. Hopefully they don't make that same mistake down in the United States. Again, each state will be different. It'll be quite interesting to see how it goes. But I'm quite sure that we'll be seeing hemp in Washington State, Colorado, California. I think Kentucky passed a law for growing hemp recently as well.
Bluegrass.
Pardon?
Iowa.
Iowa. I was going to say, like, there's a small handful. And it's even just in the last little while, a lot of this has been busting out. I read online this week that in the U.S. there were 1,700 pieces of legislation in different U.S. states for marijuana being passed this year alone. 1,700 pieces of legislation referring to cannabis in one form or another. And I get the sense most of them in a more positive light than, almost every state is at the very least reconsidering the punishments if they're not looking at, the future industry of it. And so, in a way now, cannabis activism more than ever is all about finding that right, kind of business or product or service to get into that not only, helps, move things forward, but contributes to your own economic well-being. That has certainly been a real hard thing to do in the past, but as each month and year goes by, there's more opportunity for that now. And so, it's going to be really interesting to see how far it all goes. We're really at the very beginning of the legalization of this plant. So there's, just huge potential, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm going to come back to the Sensible BC campaign there, because right now we have this ballot initiative that's in our hands, and in my 18 years of activism, have never had such an opportunity. And so it's been really at times draining, but at other times invigorating to have this opportunity. And I just really hope that many of you, and obviously I know many of you are, but other people watching the video, seize upon that opportunity, if they're in BC anyway, and help out with this, because it's an important one-shot deal. I say 40 years after the United States started to do it, so it's about time.
I've got a question for you, Ted. When are you getting the next Michelle Rainey Award?
I'm not going to win that again this year. I'm going to make sure I don't, and that, and let them know that I don't want my name forward for that. But
I remember when you got that first one.
Thanks. Yeah, Red's referring to an award I won last year, the Michelle Rainey Award. I was awarded by an online website, MedPot Now. I didn't even get into online activism, but online group of Canadian activists last year gave me an award for the top activist in Canada.
You didn't put it
and
down.
So
you didn't put it down once the entire day.
I was quite proud of it, but I'm going to make sure. Red's question was if I'm going to win it again, and I'm going to make sure that it's given to somebody else. Thanks for the mention.
No problem.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming out. Thought I'd have trouble filling up an hour on that, but I guess not. Have a great day. Again, Dr. Hornby's going to be here for the lecture next week, so hope to see you all more. Have a great day. Thanks for coming.